What is up, everybody? This is the Sharp Angles podcast, the Thursday morning edition of the Sharp Angles podcast, our first one for 2025. So welcome to the new year. Talking about the fantasy football week to come. Not a ton of talk about that, actually. We'll get to that in just a second. The fantasy football week to come, though, with the one, the only, Mr. Rich Hribar. How you doing, Rich?
Listen, happy New Year to everybody. Like you said, it's the last week of the 2024 season, but it's the first show of 2025. So, happy New Year and goodbye as well.
Goodbye. It's funny. We always this week or this show, the purpose of the show is to kind of preview the fantasy week and all of that stuff. But hopefully you're not playing in a league that's playing your fantasy Super
No,
Bowl in this week. I really hope that you're not. If you are, uh, submit some votes to get that to change. If you are, though, you can get into the comments and ask questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. We'll talk a little bit about DFS and stuff like that. Who's playing in week 18? Who's actually trying all of that stuff? But we wanted to this week spend a lot more time thinking about moving forward to next year and kind of hits and misses. Not as much to congratulate ourselves or beat ourselves up about it, but more just kind of big picture ideas and thoughts. So we're going to get to that. Before we do, though, I do think we should start with week 18 and how difficult this week is from, hopefully, again, you're not setting like a fantasy lineup for your championship, but even from a DFS perspective, we've got the Chiefs, the Bills, the Eagles, and the Rams. Like, definitely we know for a fact they're sitting. The Texans could sit. The Chargers could sit if the Steelers win on Saturday. Then the Chargers have nothing to play for. They could sit. We have a lot of other kind of interesting situations. And so I guess the overall thought is, when you're looking at this from DFS perspective, how are you approaching this? Are you trying to really go after those values of, the Carson Wentz's and the Tanner McGee's or people like that? Are you more just focused on the games that we expect to be competitive and expect people to try on and, kind of build your lineups from there?
it's always kind of nebulous. It just depends on. It's kind of unique every year. If we have like clear cut layouts, if there's like a clear pricing, discrepancy versus a guy we know it's going to get a huge workload, all those things kind of come into play. This year we do have a couple like real good spots still of like guys that are playing in games that matter that we know have high upside. Obviously, if you play on FanDuel, you have Lions Vikings available. It's the highest total of the NFL season. The last game of the year is going to be the highest total of the whole season. We've got guys like Baker Mayfield in a must-win spot against this New Orleans Saints team that who knows who the Saints are going to put on the field this week. They've got a couple guys going for, Alvin Kamara needs like 50 yards. We don't know if he's going to be able to play to get his first 1,000-yard season. They've just been trotting out just dudes. Like Clyde Edwards-Helaire was getting like significant run and may get significant run again if Kendre Miller can't play. So the Buccaneers are in a really good spot. We've got the Commanders, who Dan Quinn says they want to try to secure that 6th seed, which does matter in the NFC. Sean McVay doesn't care, but it's I think you and I would agree that playing the Buccaneers is probably the more optimal path, to try to fight through the NFC, waters though, than try to,
Are
go
you
through
teeing up?
the
Are you teeing up a hot take for me on what the Rams are doing? All right, so this is Sean McVay's philosophy. They do it in the preseason. He's just following through. I get
yeah.
that. There is such a material difference between being the number 4 seed and the number 3 seed in the NFC this year. Because if you're the number 3 seed, then you're going to play the Commanders or you're going to play the Packers, which, I mean, those are good teams. I'm not saying you're definitely going to win those, but if the Rams are home against the Commanders, they're probably favored. At home against the Packers, we'll see, but it's closer to a pick 'em. If the Rams are at home against the Lions or Vikings, they're underdogs in that game. Like, there's no doubt in my mind they're underdogs in the game. And because the NFC is so top heavy, like, you want to avoid that in the first round if at all possible. At least I would want to avoid that. And so it is, this is their philosophy. And like, this is kind of the thing we had with Dan Quinn in the argument last week. And ultimately, I think that there is some value in having like a way you do things and sticking to that. And obviously Dan Quinn did that on
Yeah, Dan Campbell.
Monday night. I mean, excuse me, not Dan Quinn. Yeah, Dan Campbell. Excuse me. Did that on Monday night, and it was fine. Everything mostly worked out there, and so that's fine. And Sean McVay is going to stick to what he's done in the past, both in the preseason and then the other situations like this they've been in. But like, you look at this situation, and what the Rams are doing is confusing to me. Now it's going to be hilarious if like the Bucks lose and it doesn't matter, or if like the Rams are able to come out and Blake Corum runs for 470 yards and they just win this game anyway. And so like there are outs here for them, but it's just am I off base on this, or are you with me on this? It's just a weird decision to me.
It's always tough. I mean, it's tough because anytime like we have a league where if you're in the fantasy league, if you're the one seed, you get to pick your opponent, like who you face, and sometimes that's a double-edged sword, right? Like it is. So like he's saying like, hey, we're in the playoffs. I don't want anyone hurt this last week. I want to make sure my team is full strength, and we don't care who we play. We're going to have to beat really good teams anyways. I get it. Like you and I on the outside look at it, it's like, yes, I would rather host the Commanders in the first week of the playoffs for sure if I had that. But I mean, he's looking at just trying to get out this group of veterans healthy, and then so I do understand it. I mean, do I fully agree? Probably not, but I do understand like where he's coming from. So it's a tough spot, and you might not even beat the Seahawks anyways. But
Yeah, well, that's the other problem. And Puka Nacua gets hurt like every
we've seen
7
this
plays.
last year though. AJ Brown got hurt in week 18, couldn't play in the first round of playoffs, and they get
Sam
destroyed.
Laporta.
Yeah,
We had
Laporta
the
ended up
Laporta knee
playing because
injury.
he's a demon, but
Yeah, sure. But like, I mean, it is. We've seen the injuries happen, and to be fair, like I said, this is McVay's philosophy. He's doing it. He's a much smarter football person than me. He's a much more successful football person than me. So there you go. We also have, Brock Purdy's going to be out due to injury this week. We're probably going to have a lot of like similar situations. You mentioned the Bucks. I want to talk about that game, the Bucks versus the Saints, because I actually think the Ravens on Saturday are kind of in a similar spot here, where I wonder if the Saints just have nothing to push back. Like they don't push back.
Mhm.
If Derek Carr and Alvin Kamara don't play, which would be what I would expect at this point, especially Carr, but most likely Kamara as well. If they're not playing, then like if the Bucks are just up in the third quarter by 21, 24 points, essentially an insurmountable lead for this version of the Saints offense, do they take their foot off the gas pedal? Do they not really go all out? And so I do think there is some concern in that game. I think there's some concern in Falcons Panthers. You're obviously much more confident in the Panthers' ability to push back against the Falcons, maybe even like win that game with the way they've been playing. But that game against Tampa Bay last week, notwithstanding, but the way they've been playing previous to that. But like if the Falcons see the Bucks are up by like 20 or 30, like what do they do? I do think they're even with these teams that we know are motivated to go out and win and they need to win. There's some like, all right, but how much are they really going to push? And like I said, the Ravens on Saturday, like this Browns team maybe playing Bailey Zappi at quarterback, swapping snaps between Dorian Thompson Robinson and Bailey Zappi at quarterback. Like, how much pushback are the Ravens going to get? Are they just going to be up by like 40 in the third quarter and we don't see Derrick Henry or Lamar Jackson again? And so I do think even for these teams that have clear motivation, there have to be some worry about what we might see, and if coaches are going to be more willing to kind of pull those starters than they otherwise would be. So that's certainly something I'm thinking about heading into this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, those are always things that are tough to nail, like, trying to predict like the prestige game script, because even if those scenarios exist, that means that those guys were probably part of how those teams
That's the
built those
argument.
leads. They
Exactly.
built
That
those
is the
leads,
argument.
right?
Yep.
Like if the
Yep.
Buccaneers have 30 points, I assume that Bucky Irving and Mike Evans did something to contribute to those 30 points. It's,
How
you
dare
know.
you? How dare you disrespect? How dare you disrespect Payne Durham, who's not even going to play because he's hurt in DNP on Wednesday. No, that is the argument. That's the other side of the argument as well. But
That's
like
always
we
tough,
saw it,
yeah.
yeah, we saw it with Josh Jacobs a couple weeks ago, and this is vividly in my mind because Josh Jacobs in that game scored enough points to beat me in one league and not enough to get me the win in the other one by
Yeah.
like 1 point on either side. He managed to middle me by like a point, which I just wild. Thanks, fantasy football, for always delivering the biggest heartbreaks you possibly can. But yeah, so like it does matter to some degree, especially in DFS. But yeah, there you go. You mentioned there are some good situations. I mean, like Ray Davis stands out to me as somebody who I'm pretty interested in and excited about. I mentioned Blake Corum. There are some guys out there that, while I'm not going to really be chasing the quarterbacks, I don't think with these guys, I do think there are certainly some skill position players that we can chase and are interesting. Any other names other than those two kind of stand out to you, or do you disagree with me about those two?
No, I think that from a price stance, they make sense. I mean, it is a pretty good running back slate for the guys that we believe have motivation, especially like I said, if you do play on FanDuel, you have Jahmyr Gibbs, we got Bijan
Yeah.
Robinson against the Panthers, Bucky Irving, in a really good spot too, as like a favorite that needs the win. I do think that the one thing that does stand out with the guys like Corum and Ray Davis and potentially even Will Shipley, they all have really good matchups they play. The one thing to remember is though that those guys are also not going to play with other starters. It's not like when
Yeah.
Ray Davis filled in for James Cook in week 6 with Josh Allen on the field and, Deion Dawkins and the full offensive line. It's going to be probably Ray Davis running, with Mitchell Trubisky and some backup linemen. And I think that's what ultimately just steered the ship for Nick Sirianni on the Saquon factor. It wasn't as simple as playing Saquon and having him push the record. He was going to have to play multiple starters with Saquon Barkley. And I think that's probably what swayed the decision to not have Saquon Barkley even play in this last game because, you have to play Jordan Mailata. You got to play Cam Jurgens. And like I said, they're a team that got burned last year by playing AJ Brown. So you do have those kind of factors. But I think from a pricing standpoint, like you guys like Ray Davis and Blake Corum, they're priced so cheaply that it kind of doesn't really matter if you can get the volume at those price points. Then if you can get a touchdown and do things like, just have the volume to get there. Like those guys are definitely in play this week. And like I said, Will Shipley is a guy to watch too. I know he practiced yesterday because they all have good matchups, like individually. So
Yeah, and people. So I'm interested that you mentioned Will Shipley because one of my things in the waiver wire column when I was writing it, kind of in this kind of back half of the season, it was mentioning that Kenneth Gainwell's the guy getting touches whenever Saquon's healthy. But if something were to happen to Saquon, I would be very interested in Will Shipley. And if we saw Will Shipley, I'm interested now that you've said that because I was under the assumption people would be in on Kenny Gainwell this week.
I would assume
Um,
he doesn't play a lot though either though.
so it's an interesting point of view. I haven't looked at I've mentioned this before. I do not look at ownership projections until after I've kind of decided what I'm going to do, and then I
And
kind of adjust from there.
it's a fool's errand to even look at it right now anyways.
Fair enough. But I was under the assumption Kenny Gainwell will kind of be popular, and I thought I could get cute with Will Shipley if he plays, as you said.
It
He's
might
dealing
be
with
possible. I haven't looked at anything either.
yeah.
I would assume from my perspective that they're not gonna give Kenny Gainwell a huge run out either, though.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I was interested in playing Will Shipley. Like that is the guy, the
Yeah, and we've
Philadelphia back
seen
that I'm
McVay
interested in playing.
even the other thing is the other guys on the depth chart. We've seen when McVay mentioned Blake Corum getting a larger workload, he also brought up Cody Schrader's name in the same sentence. So like you might see some of the other depth pieces get run too and get opportunities.
Yeah, it's
Week
certainly
18,
going to be
man. Week
interesting.
18.
It's going to be interesting. Rich is going to have a massive DFS write up about that he does every week, looking at tournament plays, looking at core plays, looking at game stacks. All of that is going to be available on the site on Friday. So if you're playing DFS or if you're just interested, in what players we expect to do well, maybe from a prop, I'd highly recommend you read that. That is part of our fantasy package, but you get access to that if you purchase our playoff package, which you can get for $250 off any of our NFL playoff packages, $250 off using promo code ANGLES. Make sure you check that out. We're destroying bowl season. We're 13-4 in bowl season already. We've historically done very well during the NFL playoffs. We're having one of our best seasons of all time. Actually, just put an article up on the website about our futures, which we absolutely smashed. We're going to end up hitting Bucky Irving rookie rushing yards win, which was 26-1 when we gave it out. We're having a really good season overall. Make sure you stick around with us for the postseason package. And like I said, a benefit of that is you'll get access to those DFS picks from Rich for this week, which is going to be an important read, I think, as we really try to parse through this odd situation that we have here for Week 18 DFS. I am excited. I was worried I was going to have to. I have some pretty high price tickets, and I was worried I was going to have to use some of them this week. And I'm happy that I've now learned there will be playoff competitions for some of those, and I will not have to use those because some high price tickets went to waste last week. So I didn't want to lose any more here in our week 18 DFS. Thank you, Jayden Reed. I really appreciate that. That actually brings me on to talking about some of the stuff we want to talk about, which are just hits and misses that we had this season. And like I said at the top, we're not interested in patting ourselves on the back or really like flogging ourselves. Although I am more interested in that than patting myself on the back as per usual. But I do think that this is kind of an interesting way these names are an interesting way to think about the future 2025 fantasy drafts, what we can learn from them, what we can do moving forward. And I guess we could just start with Jayden Reed because we've now had this running thing with him, which I came to a crescendo last week with his 1 for 6 when I
Yep.
know both you and I were on him. It was the one time we're like, all right, yeah, we're in on Jayden Reed. After a few weeks, we had our producer Matt make the we were wrong about Jayden Reed because we were low on him all off season. As it turns out, we've come back around. I don't think we were wrong about Jayden Reed. But what I think is interesting to talk about this is, first of all, why we were a little lower on Jayden Reed, but also just this: don't make your judgments early in the season and continue to adjust as we go out, because what we saw the Packers do after the bye week informed a lot of what happened with Jayden Reed. And so this game is evolving. And I like how you always talk about production and looking at end of season rankings, end of season like finishes for players, that those aren't really important. What's important is thinking about these little 5 and 6 games windows of production. Would it be great if someone produced over an entire season? Yeah, that's what you're hoping your first round pick does. But for most players, we're looking for these little pockets of production. And I think that this Jayden Reed thing is a way to, really think about that. Don't make your mind up early. Think about these players as we move on. Make changes to how you think about players. And I think Jayden Reed's a great example of that based on kind of what we thought of him after, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks.
I mean, Jayden Reed fits a lot of different, kind of archetypes like to be wary of. Like Tank Dell so I treated Jayden Reed and Tank Dell very similarly this season because coming into the year, they were probably guys that were going to be stuck playing in 3 wide receiver sets, maybe not have the same kind of target opportunities that they had a year ago. And that immediately was a red flag. Obviously, they had great seasons last year. Jayden Reed opens the year. He has 2 top 5 weeks in the first 4 weeks. Big spike weeks. And then he has no wide receiver 1 scoring finishes after week 4. The final 10 games of the season, he has 2 weeks higher than wide receiver 35. Just absolute nightmare fuel. And the thing about fantasy football is you always want to care about spike weeks first. Like this was always the thing with Mike Evans for his career. People like Mike Evans is too inconsistent, which also wasn't even true. But spike weeks win you games more than low weeks lose you games. But we also weren't getting any spike weeks from Jayden Reed either. Like it wasn't like he was just a volatile player. He just wasn't a good player towards the end of the season, like literally the last 10 weeks. But and so we weren't even getting the spike weeks. But these players that don't have the target opportunities that are more efficiency based, like you always have to be a little leery on those guys. And the thing that sucks is that they're very good players. That's why they open with that efficiency. It's what makes them attractive to draft in the first place. But they have to run so pure and from a fantasy football stance to deliver on that ADP that it's tough to invest in those guys. And this year in particular was a little bit different because a guy like Jayden Reed, it was more about where he was falling in context of top down ADP, not necessarily wide receiver ADP. It was where the wide receiver, whatever, I don't even remember what he was. I want to say like off top
He
of
was
my
like
head,
wide
like
receiver 30,
36, right?
35.
Yeah.
He was 33 in the final ones I saw, but yeah, it was always in that 30 to 35 range is where I always
Right.
kind of
And
saw
that's
him.
fine. Like you're taking a guy's a fringe wide receiver 3 and you understand there's volatility there. It was the point was what wide receiver 33, wide receiver 35, wide receiver 36. Those guys were going this year, we're going next to like RB18, RB20, like those types of guys. And they're like the Joe Mixons of the world, the Aaron Joneses of the world, guys that had very clear opportunity work, like projectable workloads that were going to be viable. And that's where like the the point of like schism came where it's like, dude, I can't take Jayden Reed on any of these teams. I can't take Tank Dell on any of these teams over these guys. So just something to kind of keep in mind when the landscape changes. So I've had a few times this year already in the Sunday chats of like, what are we going to do next year with running backs? And it's like, well, we need to see what the landscape is going to look like. We need to see where all the players are going, not just like, hey, are we going to aggressively draft running backs again and like oscillate back? And we need to see where the field moves to and where we kind of have the pieces and where they fall and how we just adjust and calibrate there. Because it's not about taking zero RB or doing anchor B. A lot of zero RB teams that still end up being good. If you landed Bucky Irving, if you landed Chase Brown, like there was a lot of home runs in those types of builds too. So I mean, we needed to see. It's not just like there's a lot of ways to skin a cat in fantasy football, and we'll see where the landscape goes, though. Like I said.
I do think that that's an important kind of thing to bring up because we could talk about several running back hits because I talked about this in the offseason. I'm not patting myself on the back. It's got a lot of things wrong. But in the offseason, I was looking at that when we were talking about kind of what the dead zone was and that kind of whole idea of the dead zone was based on a lot of the times who you were having to draft those running backs ahead of to do it because running backs were pushed higher. And I consistently said over and over again, that is if you're thinking about it in that way this year, that's a flawed way of thinking because those running backs are not being drafted where they were previously being drafted. They're being drafted 2 rounds lower. And if that changes the math, that changes the equation. And so we did get some hits in there. We also got lucky though. Like, I think that that's an important thing to remember is that there was a lot of, and I can just know this from doing the waiver wire every week and the kind of lack of these like high end, you're going to blow a ton of fab on them kind of options, especially in the middle part of the season, made doing that article, very difficult. There were weeks where there just weren't running back pickups. Like there were weeks where I was excited to maybe get a chance to pick up Alexander Madison, right? That's kind of where we were if you were running back needy. And so that's part of this equation as well. So we can't overreact to that aspect of it. And then also the other side of it, as you said, if this landscape changes and the overreaction to what we saw this year is that we're going to keep push running backs back up, then suddenly we are in that old situation that we're in. And I think thinking about, like you said, Jayden Reed is a good example because he's been a running joke on here. And I saw producer Matt put up our new graphic for Jayden Reed. We were wrong. We're marking it out now. We're right. Yeah, we don't know, right? But this has been this running joke. So Jayden Reed's just an example here. But if Jayden Reed is again the wide receiver 33, let's say, but instead of being drafted next to the running back 18, he's being drafted next to the running back 26, then that changes kind of the equation on how you view him from a value perspective. And that's why I guess we're taking the election, right? We all exist in the context of what came before us, right? The draft exists in the context of what is around you, and I think that that's important to think about. So, like Saquon Barkley, I think finished ADP as the running back 4, which you would think of that and say, well, then he's definitely not a value. But where you were able to get him, kind of in that second round, especially in earlier drafts, you were able to get him in kind of the middle of that second round. That's a value. If the running back 4 is going the same type of running back 4 is going pick 8, then maybe that's different. And so it's all about paying attention to what the trends are and how much these players are actually costing, because that's going to change kind of how you view it. So this year I went pretty running back heavy and I had a lot of success doing so, especially kind of in those middle rounds, because I got lucky from an injury perspective and also because of the value. But I kind of doubt that I'm doing that this coming up season because I doubt that things are going to be priced in that way. And it's just an important thing to remember.
I wrote an article, a series actually on the website. It's a part of the draft kit every year about, just how we can draft, certain players, how we can identify certain players to draft. And the running back one, especially, was just littered with like nothing but great things. The type of archetype of running backs to draft in the dead zone. Because the one thing that you brought up too, that like, so the dead zone has like a kind of a nebulous definition, but the way I've always described it is like in context of the running back position. So even when the running back ADP changes, like this year it was lower, the dead zone still exists. It still exists within the position. That's how I've always identified it. And like the players you successfully want to like brave, picking in that running back dead zone, that RB2 zone, are guys that are on their rookie contracts and guys that catch the football. We talked about in that article, avoiding guys like, Zamir White, but being on even an older player like Alvin Kamara because of his pass catching ability in the dead zone. And then we talk about using the dead zone to work for you, getting those running backs that are attached to some of those guys in those picks, or were attached to cheap running backs, because cheap running back ones historically have been traps, in drafts. So like the hit rate for the guys that were in that bucket were just astronomical. Again, it was just another huge year for hit rates. Guys like Rico Dowdle, Chase Brown, even had a little pocket. Well, Chuba Hubbard was also another one, but then we didn't get like the full run out for guys like Tajay Spears, but like Tyrone Tracy was in that bucket. And it's not about just having Zach Charbonnet is another guy. It's not like you had the full run out where you get these guys for a whole year. Chase Brown and Chuba Hubbard are like the two examples of that. But even like a couple week sample of like the Zach Charbonnet games were great. like just having him be able to plug in your lineup for those weeks where there are identifiable matchups that can swing you weeks with based on how you drafted the rest of your roster. So yeah, I mean, I go back to that series all the time, and just like that stuff was just littered with nothing but just like good advice.
Yeah, and my kind of like thought about kind of the luck aspect of it is that like I like Tony Pollard this year, and Tony Pollard doesn't fit what you just said, right? He didn't fit that at all, and he tried to get hurt every single game, and obviously ended up missing last week. He's probably going to play now because Najee Spears has a concussion, but he didn't really fit that as well as you would want. Not on his rookie contract. He can catch passes, but we didn't really know what was going to happen in that Titans offense, and so that's what I'm saying. There was still some luck involved in who got hurt and who didn't. But yeah, I think that your point is clear. And there were other guys, and so like you have to think about things in terms of where did we end up in drafts and where did we start in drafts, right? And so like James Conner, for instance, ended up being a lot more expensive than he was if you were drafting in June and July. I remember there was a time when there was like 3 spots between James Conner and Trey Benson, which never made any sense, but it's kind of where we were. And so like you have to think about things in those terms. I think about a lot about Josh Jacobs and what happened to Josh Jacobs's ADP and how he kind of vacillated throughout the year. We saw Kyron Williams and kind of what happened to his ADP. And so, yeah, just kind of reacting to those, especially if you're the kind of person that is drafting. You're not just drafting your home leagues in August, but you're participating in Best Ball Mania, and kind of paying attention to all that stuff is, always important as we go through this as well. Another thing I want to talk a little bit about, and is quarterback, because you really had a big hit at quarterback this year with Jayden Daniels. You were very high on Jayden Daniels, but we also had a big miss on Anthony Richardson, right? Anthony Richardson didn't hit, and we liked those players for similar reasons, not for the same reasons, but for similar reasons. And I think it's interesting to think about kind of the fact that, why are we interested in Jayden Daniels, and think about why he hit, but then also think about Anthony Richardson was a miss, but why that doesn't matter as much, and why we should continue to chase players like Anthony Richardson, even though we certainly missed on him this year.
Well, they're a little bit different. They're not quite in the
Yeah.
same bucket. So the pro thing for Jayden Daniels first, because Jayden Daniels, even in the draft approach, like he was my number 1 draft target based on cost. There are a lot of leagues where like why I play like in leagues with like you and other gamers that push quarterbacks down, and I have the opportunity to draft a higher end quarterback like Jalen Hurts way lower than typical like general population ADP is. But like in general population ADP, like Jayden Daniels, that cost was by far my number 1 target. And it's because of the duality that he provided. It was, I comped him coming out for fantasy purposes, like early career Deshaun Watson, definitely not Brown's version of Deshaun Watson, but a player that offered mobility. He offered you like the Konami code, like pure upside, like that rushing weighted production, but also what entered the NFL as a prospect, one of the most decorated passers as well. So you were going to be able to double dip. That's like that's the dream in fantasy football, is to do the Lamar Jackson season this year, right? Like where you have the rushing and you have the elite passing. Those guys are really hard to combat in fantasy football. Josh Allen's basically lived on that spectrum the last 4 years, where he just consistently delivers as QB1 or QB2 on a point per game basis, because you're getting both of those. Anthony Richardson is more of the throwback Konami code guy, where
Yes.
we were hoping he was going to put enough passing together to be that kind of to have that jump like we talked about with Jayden Daniels, where we got. But we also knew he was very much also in the potential to be on like the Justin Fields spectrum, where it's like all you get is rushing.
Yep.
and that's kind of what happened to Anthony Richardson. And you see the fragility like that archetype has, where you don't have, because if you don't have that insulation of the passing, you have a lower floor, and you don't have as high of a ceiling either. Because a lot of people think of like the Konami code is like this thing that creates spike weeks, but it actually is more about creating just like a back end QB1, like a floor based dude, like when Taysom Hill or Justin Fields took over. Like that rushing is all you're getting to basically push you to be a QB1, because it's weighted, it's heavier scored than passing is. But then if you don't have the passing to go with it, you can't like hit that crescendo. You can't flirt with actually being the QB1 overall like Jayden Daniels did. And that's the thing that we always knew existed with Anthony Richardson, but you still have to bite on that, because if you do hit it, like you can't, like that archetype is just so thin. Like there's not many of those players in a given season. I mean, look at Jalen Hurts even this year. Like Jalen Hurts, even the last 2 years, I guess you can count this for Jalen Hurts. Like he, as a passer, he didn't really like have a lot of passing juice, but he did just enough and was so like efficient when he did throw that like it made him so really hard to combat in fantasy football. And we just never got that with Anthony Richardson. And that was something we always knew from his prospect profile and his year one profile, which was a disaster as a passer that existed. But you still have to kind of like take those shots versus the pure pocket passers, because in any given football season, finding a guy that hits like Jayden Daniels is very finite. It's very rare you have a guy that archetype that can run and pass and you hit a home run for a cheap price. But you're always going to run into a Jared Goff. You're always going to run into a Geno Smith from a couple years ago, a Baker Mayfield, a Sam Darnold this year. The guys that have like these optimal passing seasons, you can find those guys deeper in the drafts that can maybe be more arbitrage on a CJ Stroud. We'll be doing the same thing with Joe Burrow that we did with CJ Stroud last year. The Justin Herberts, the guys that have to pass first, you can let those guys, let gamers take those guys high, because you have to thread such a needle to hit on that ADP. Like those guys have to flirt with 40 passing touchdowns. Like Joe Burrow had to have the season he had to justify his ADP. And then you think about all the guys that missed in that pocket, that archetype. Patrick Mahomes. We talked about Stroud. Like those guys, like Dak Prescott, like even before Dak Prescott hurt, was trending towards being like a really big miss in that pocket. So like it's just really hard to say like, all right, I know that Anthony Richardson comes at risk, but he still, like if Anthony Richardson next year falls to like, let's say like QB 15 in ADP, like I feel like that's a colossal mistake by gamers. So like, because the upside is still too prevalent.
I agree with that. And I think that the kind of replaceability that you mentioned is the important part. The other thing, and this is really why I prompted both of them together, is because I was hoping you'd talk about the difference, because I do think the difference is meaningful, not just in like you said, from a ceiling perspective and what are we going to get, but like a lot of the names you talked about, the kind of shelf life you have there is small. And we saw, not are we just worried about Anthony Richardson from an injury perspective, because he's probably not going to play this week as well, so we're worried about that, but just from like a keeping the starting job perspective, you have to be worried about if someone just really can't make those throws. And we saw Justin Fields earlier this year, have okay. Like he was doing fine from a fantasy perspective in some of those games. They weren't always the best games. And then it's just gone, right? Because they want to go to Russell Wilson because they think Russell Wilson gives them a better chance to win. And so I do think that is an important thing when we're talking about, I haven't studied the rookies. I don't know who's coming in and who we're going to think about in those terms. But if we're thinking about like who's getting jobs and what quarterbacks we might be targeting, I do think there's a lot more risk in the Anthony Richardson type of quarterback that we're looking for here than there are in like Jayden Daniels. Like I think that if I was going back in time without even like, I guess maybe without even knowing results, although I don't know how to do that. But like I would just, the Jayden Daniels aspect of it is way less risky, even though he's a rookie, because we had some idea of what he could be and he costs less. But as you say, if Anthony Richardson costs less, then that limits some of the risk. But
Right.
I think putting players into those kind of different buckets is important. And you mentioned Lamar Jackson. I mean, Lamar Jackson, I guess that's kind of a hit for me. I said a lot of the summer that we should have been drafting him as the overall QB1. And one of the reasons was I expected him to have, a better passing season. I expected to kind of see that in addition to what we already saw from him. And so like that's the holy grail. That's what we're looking for. And I think that that's an important distinction to make when we're talking about, this quote unquote, Konami code kind of situation. So I think that that's important. One more here, and this is something that I know you talk about a lot, is these first contract players, specifically these rookies and sophomores, and how if you're going to get breakout, that's going to come from them. We obviously saw a lot of breakouts from rookies. We also saw some rookies, disappoint, but I still think kind of what we saw this year, that continues to hold true. We need to be looking at these rookies. We need to be looking at these sophomores when we're trying to find these breakout players.
Oh yeah, this is just a tried and true staple. This is again where you don't even have to get like players right, like individual player takes right.
Yep.
And that's what I love about, like, we talked about the running back ADP article and the wide receiver ADP article. It's the same thing. And so one thing, like you always have like hype, like early round rookies always come with hype, and there's always an excitement with those guys. They tend to carry some like inflated ADP. We saw that like Marv Harrison, this year. I mean, Jack Smith and Jigba last year was a guy that definitely did not meet his ADP,
And
but
I think that I wanted to talk about Marvin Harrison just while you mentioned him. I think that that's important to remember too, is that if the ADP gets inflated, you've removed the breakout upside, and that's what I said
right.
about Marvin Harrison in the lead up to where we were drafting him. You were drafting him at his breakout upside, right? Marvin Harrison like seems like this massive fantasy disappointment, and I get it. But you look at his final numbers; they're not terrible, and they did come in weird pockets of production, and that helps to kind of lead to this like view of him because from a week to week perspective it wasn't good, but like ultimately that's because of where we were drafting him, not as much to do with Marvin Harrison. You were drafting him at that upside. Whereas when you look at two players that I completely missed on in Lad McConkey and Brian Thomas Jr., I didn't have as much of them as certainly as I needed to have. They were not being drafted in that way, and so that's why they end up kind of being this way. And so it's not. It's again, it's like these quarterback conversation. Not all rookies and second year players are built the same. We have to really pay attention to their cost versus what maybe this upside is, and aim for those rookies that are probably being drafted below their upside, and maybe be wary about some of them that are be drafted, really, really high.
I mean, the real top down like angle of this all is, and I have like data in these articles that show you like the hit rates and everything, but fantasy football in general, gamers have to see something before they believe it.
Yeah.
Like, and that's what steers kind of these ships, or like these guys being, priced down. Like people are like, oh yeah, because like take Lad McConkey, for example. It's just like, well, he's an okay prospect. He didn't necessarily have like gaudy stats, but there was like a lot of real good underlying stuff. He was going to be probably the wide receiver one on his team, on a team we didn't project to throw. So people are like ho hum about him. But like you just draft like, on your bench, you just add these guys to your roster, and you try to run into those hit rates, because now that we've seen Lad McConkey be good, people will elevate his ADP. Jackson Njigba is an example where he got to play last year as a rookie, and people were kind of let down. So his ADP fell back down because people are like, well, we haven't seen him be good, so therefore he either isn't good or we need to see him be good. That's just how fantasy gamers are, man, in general. So that's why in general, like these year one, year two rookie contract guys have historically been just like better picks and more so at wide receiver than running back, just because running back is so opportunity driven, but definitely wide receiver. Just because, like I said, gamers have to see like where's the proof. And by then, when we're talking about like when you're talking about like later guys that you might luck box into, veterans that are in the same boat that just haven't been good, right? Like it's like Courtland Sutton's like an example this year. Like Courtland Sutton to this point in his career had been a pretty lackluster fantasy option. That's why it was priced into his ADP. He really hadn't hit, but now he'll probably shoot up a little bit because we've seen him be good, especially if like depending what Denver does. But these rookie guys are just priced down there because they've never done anything, so people don't know how to handle them. So like a guy like like I said, JSN is like the number one guy that I think that probably gamers just like left on the board a little bit this year. And it's like, hey, you take a shot on him, and hell, for 8 weeks that didn't even look good. And it was the final 8 weeks of the season blew up. Ironically, JSN playing the best football of the season while Seattle's offense played their worst football of the season is a conundrum we'll be revisiting like this entire offseason.
Yeah, but I get it. We come back to pockets of production,
Yeah,
looking for
yeah.
these pockets of production, which I do think is important. To your point, we're going to talk about all this stuff ad nauseum as we go through the off season. You and I will get back to more regularly scheduled program next week as we preview playoff games and things of that nature. But I did think it was an interesting conversation to have as we get into these drafts. And like I said, when we're talking in April and we're talking in May and June and July, they think that keeping these thoughts in mind are important as we move forward. However, I do want to talk a little bit about the games to come. You mentioned the Lions Vikings earlier in the show, and I do think that's an important part to start. Unfortunately, if you're playing at DraftKings, that is not available to you in the DFS slate. It is available at FanDuel. However, you mentioned the total. I have it at 56.5 points. It might have gone up even since I took that note down 2 hours ago. I made mention I tweeted about this. The Lions have the worst defense and yards per play allowed over the last 2 weeks, but their offense, we know what they can do from an efficiency standpoint. And they, if they're forced to throw more in this game with this could be. I mean, this game is just so exciting from a fantasy perspective, from what we might see here, from how good these two teams are. Like, I don't even really know what to say about it. I'm excited. Like, I'm excited for everything we're going to see here. I'm excited about Justin Jefferson. I'm excited about Jordan Addison. I'm excited about Jahmyr Gibbs, the overall running back one without David Montgomery. I'm excited about everything. That's kind of my game preview for this game.
Yeah, and selfishly, like I'm listening. The Packers are a good team, and selfishly, we just wanted this scenario set up, right? Like we wanted this to
Absolutely.
be the final game of the season for the stakes are real. Like the number 1 seed versus the number 5 seed are absolutely real, especially if you're the Lions, a team that's just been so beat up the back half of the year, and it's not even the 2 weeks. I mean, the last 5 weeks they are 31st in points allowed per drive. They just get absolutely just thrown all over on. The crazy thing is their run defense is still pretty good outside of the Buffalo game. So like they're doing the old Lions thing where it's like, we can't stop the pass, but we're good enough to stop the run. Therefore, you have to keep passing on us. And like that's where we are. If Brock Purdy doesn't throw a couple interceptions in the second half of that game, like they might not even win that game with their starters. But their offense is still so good that they're just playing in like these barn burner games, since their injuries started to mount like these last 5 weeks. And
We've got our Lions back. That's
yeah,
what we've got. We've got
yeah, exactly.
our beloved fantasy Lions have returned to us, and we should all rejoice. If you're a Lions fan, I don't know about that. You might not be as excited about what kind of we've seen, even though they are winning, aside from that Buffalo game. So good for them. I'm excited that they're winning. But like from a fantasy perspective, rejoice. The old Lions are back. Rejoice in all of the fantasy goodness that will come from that.
Yeah, and you look at this game and this matchup because you would say on paper from the full 17-week season that like it's not necessarily a great matchup for either offense, but we already won, seeing these teams combine for 60 points in the middle of the season when the Lions defense was healthy. The Vikings had a good offensive game. Sam Darnold necessarily didn't have like an amazing fantasy game, but like when you look at like what he did in that game, he completed 82% of his passes for almost 10 yards per pass attempt. He just didn't actually, it was one of the few Sam Darnold games where he actually didn't have like good touchdown variance. It was he threw multiple touchdowns in 12 games this year. One of the ones was not against the Lions. So of the 5 weeks where he did it. So, we figure with the way the Lions are running now, like I said, over the past 5 games, they are dead last in yards per pass attempt allowed. They're 28th in touchdown rate allowed. We expect that to kind of, shift towards Darnold being able to throw more touchdowns in this game. Also in that first game, Darnold ran for 40 yards, something we continue to see a problem for the Lions. Purdy ran for a touchdown on Monday night. Dobbs comes in and runs for a touchdown on the final drive. But we now have this 3-year sample of Aaron Glenn because of how aggressive they play on defense of them giving up quarterback production. It's a huge part of Darnold's game, rushing. But like I said, he had the 40 yards in that game. Also, we know that the Lions, even though they've had all these injuries, Aaron Glenn's not doing anything to kind of calibrate around this. Over the past 5 weeks, the Lions are second in the NFL in rate of man coverage, and they're third in blitz rate. So not even it's like it's absolutely insane that they've had all these injuries. Aaron Glenn's like, you know what I'm gonna do? Double down, baby. This is what we're
Let's
gonna
keep it
do.
up. Let's do it.
So
I love it.
and
I love it.
look at the splits, like Justin Jefferson, particularly in this matchup, because we've seen Justin Jefferson now the back half of the year. And I know he didn't have a huge run out for fantasy gamers that played in the championship last week, but he's now had double-digit targets in 3 straight games. We've seen him have some pop-off spike weeks, and he has a 32% target share against man coverage. He has a 36% target share when Sam Darnold is blitzed this year. You look at these last 3 games he's had in this matchup against Aaron Glenn, 11 for the last 4 games, 11 for 223, 6 for 141, 12 for 192, 7 for 81, a touchdown. And that was with Carlton Davis in that first matchup. So it's like, man, like Justin Jefferson feels like a tremendous pop-off spot. Amon-Ra has absolutely just destroyed against Brian Flores because of the structure of defense Brian Flores wants to play. Brian Flores wants you to throw hots all the time. He's sending zone blitzes. He's sending DBs all the time at a higher rate than anyone else. He's doing the opposite here, Glenn. They're blitzing a lot, but he's playing zone coverage and shell coverage behind it. And that's been like funnel. That's why the Vikings give up so much production and so many catches to slot receivers. And that's why Amon-Ra St. Brown is like in this particular matchup, also given the Vikings nightmares. So it's like, man, there's a lot here where these teams are familiar with each other. It's just a fitting way to end the season. So I'm very excited about it.
I also think, like in this, like you said, the Vikings have been, they've been good against tight ends, but I'm also very interested in Sam Laporta here because of what we've seen from target share from him recently and what we would expect the drop back rate to be. Like, Sam Laporta, we could talk about hits and misses. I was very down on Laporta, but like what we've seen out of him in the past couple of weeks, I think is kind of past few weeks is what we would be interested in seeing from him, from like a year long perspective. So yeah, I'm interested in this. I'll tell you, if you're well placed at FanDuel this week, heading into
Yeah.
the Sunday night game, but you don't have a ton of those guys, yeah, you're cooked, man. Like I think that we're going to see a lot of really heavy stacks of this game at FanDuel, rightfully so. And I wonder if the thing is just to stack it even more than we even think other people are going to do and just play it because
That's probably
this
the site where you see more of the running backs we talked about earlier. Like
Yep,
FanDuel's probably where you get a little
absolutely.
bit more cuter with the Davis, Corum, Shipley, triad, Cerberus of cheap running backs because you want to jam in Justin Jefferson, which you're not able to do on DraftKings. You're not able to jam in Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jahmyr
Yep.
Gibbs on DraftKings.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that. I think that you're right that we're going to see a lot more of those. Which conversely, if you really want to play it, and maybe this play that these teams will be nervous and they they're not going to hit or whatever, that you could play the higher price running backs at FanDuel, right? You could play Bijan, you could play Bucky Irving, and you could try to maybe build that way and avoid this game for the most part, unless you're taking shots on, like I said, Laporta is somebody you could take a shot on, or Addison or something like that. Like there are ways into that game in that way, but I don't know. I will probably be with the chalk and trying to maybe, like you said, building Will Shipley lineups instead of Corum or Davis, and like trying to get at it that way
And
and
game
see
selection
where
matters for
we
that
go.
too.
Absolutely, it matters. Trying to get into the smaller field and just trying to outstack would be a way
Because
to get
last week
around it.
I had Baker doubles and Baker triples, and every one of those teams had Jayden Reed on it, and the large field ones were dead because of Jayden Reed's being on the roster. Because remember, I always remind people the larger the field size, the more points you need.
Yeah.
They're correlated. So Jayden Reed on those rosters hurt those rosters. Even from a caching stance, whereas in the small field stuff, they all still cashed and doubled up. So like game selection definitely matters, especially when you're thinking about like onslaughting this game fully and thinking about like, all right, if I jam in Will Shipley in this lineup and he has 3 points, that in a large field tournament probably hurts you a lot more than where if you can get this game right, just this particular game right, and Will Shipley's 3 points don't matter as much. And then
Absolutely.
if Will Shipley
Yeah,
hits,
like
then you go to the bank.
yeah, there you go. But yeah, looking for those maybe higher entry fee, lower kind of top payout, fewer than 1,000 people, or certainly fewer than 2,000 people kind of tournaments is certainly, yeah, I agree. That's where we're going. One more game here we should mention here: Steelers Bengals. Bengals, the Bengals 1.5 point favorites in this game it's interesting. Like in Pittsburgh, it's just really something, man. Especially since the Bengals, like we go through this, we talk about like the Steelers are on the skid, but like the teams that they've lost to over
Yeah.
the last 3 weeks, like they're the best teams in football, or among the best teams in football. And then we look at the Bengals and kind of some of the struggles they've had with who they've been playing, and for the Bengals to be favored, it's really interesting. It's really interesting. We also have this Pittsburgh Steelers offense with now a healthy, we'd assume fully healthy George Pickens. We don't know about his mindset, but fully healthy George Pickens coming out here. Russell Wilson threw for the second most yards of his career in the first game between these two. It's just a very interesting game if you're thinking about, especially Saturday only DFS, and what we might get out of that Ravens Browns game. Like how popular it's going to be, how can we stack it? It's a fascinating game to me.
Yeah, and the only thing I could think of with this line was just the factor of like if the Ravens just to win earlier, but like Tomlin has already talked about he's not really thinking about resting guys. Like that could be a scenario where you mentioned earlier where it's like maybe in game they they pull some of these guys at some point, but there doesn't seem to be any indication that the Steelers are going to rest guys. They're definitely approaching this from the mindset if they got that they need this game. So, and then they already, like you said, at one point in that game, they were up 17 points in the fourth quarter. Like, and then you had like some garbage stuff from Burrow that got there. I think I actually think the Bengals scored almost all the points in the fourth quarter after that Russ touchdown, or they scored a defensive touchdown in that game and went up like 41-24. And then we had some garbage time run out for Burrow in the passing game. And we probably aren't going to have Chase Brown in this game.
Yeah.
I already saw he didn't practice today before we got on with the high ankle sprain. So, without Chase Brown's been such a focal point of that offense the back half of the year, they're going to be able to get the same production out of Khalil Herbert that they were getting out of Chase Brown. So that's another wrinkle too in that game that kind of is the factor.
Yeah, and to your point about the Steelers, and I mean, we've seen it with the Rams not caring. So maybe if the Ravens come out and win, we will see that from them. But I also think for the Steelers, there's a difference between being the fifth and sixth seed. There's a difference between going and playing the Texans and going and playing likely the Ravens, right? Well, in that scenario, it would be going and playing the Ravens. There's a big difference between those two things, and so I do think they're going to go out and play. But I just can we trust Tomlin like we trust our boy Campbell from Lee? I kind of think so. Everything we've seen makes me think so. And it makes me think that the Steelers also believe that there is real value to being the fifth seed. And so I'm interested. I think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see him pushing. I hope we continue to see Jaylen Warren, his rise in that backfield. Hope we continue to see that kind of push, and it'll be interesting. One question here from the Dino Fountain, which I like. Thoughts on Geno or Bryce Young at QB? A bonus 10 points for 300 yards passing, which is very, very interesting there. Any thoughts on that one?
As much as it probably pains me to say, I kind of do like Geno in this game. So there's a couple of these spots this week that you kind of talked about, and the Falcons being one. Maybe the Falcons aren't a good example because they're still technically fighting for a playoff spot. Like they're treating this like they're going to try to win that game. But the Seahawks have been eliminated, but they have a first-year head coach, right? And Mike Macdonald. Like I don't think Mike Macdonald's going to punt this game. I also think Geno has some stuff he's going for in terms of incentives.
I was
right?
pulling it up. Yeah, I was pulling it up. I'm going to go and get it. We have a great article on the site written by
he's got some
Dustin
incentive laid and stuff too. Yep. So we have a couple of these spots where you have guys going against teams that we know are resting. We even talked about the inverse angle of that too. So like the Broncos are an interesting team, I think, too, from like a DFS perspective, like Bo Nix stacks, like Bo Nix plus Cortland Sutton plus Marvin Mims, right? Because they're going to be playing as backups. Geno Smith and the Seattle Seahawks, I don't think are going to punt this game because you have a first-year head coach, a defensive head coach too. I think they're still trying to establish a culture there. I think they want to go out and win this game against a division rival, and they're going to treat it that way. And so the Rams aren't treating that way. Like the Rams are not going to have their two pass rushers probably won't play in this game, right? Like their two best pass rushers might not play in this game. So I know Bryce Young's been playing a lot better the back half of the year than Geno Smith, but I actually think I would take a shot on Geno Smith, especially for like the bonus stuff here.
So he needs 185 or 186 yards, depending on kind of how it's set up to hit his yardage bonus. So it's not a huge number, but he needs that. They also have a win bonus in there. Like all of these are worth 2 million. They're currently at 9. They need 10 or to make playoffs. Obviously, they can't do anymore. He also has a completion rate one that he's just above the completion rate number. He has a passer rating one that it's, he needs like to gain like 10 points of pass rating. That's probably not going to happen. But yeah, and that's an interesting thing to think about. And I'm interested in kind of what do we see from them kind of late in the game and how is it going to go? So I'm with you on that one. All right, that's it for us. That's all for the 2024 regular season. We will be back next week, though, talking about the wild card round, talking about Rich Hribar's worksheets leading into the wild card round. He's going to do those throughout the playoffs. So make sure you go and check that out. That'll be part of our NFL playoff packages, which are available again for $250 off using promo code ANGLES. So make sure you check that out. Go to Sharp Football Analysis. You can find, we do have that contract incentive articles from Dustin. I did one about kind of motivations that I'm updating throughout the week as we get more coach kind of quotes in there. So a lot of that kind of information, if you're looking for that, trying to build DFS rosters. And then, as I said, the DFS write-ups from Rich will be available on Friday. So make sure you check those out as well. And he and I will be back to talk with you next week.